to do things like grow organically, purchase organic food if you can, even just occasionally, it's going to have a difference on your health. But I always like to bring out the importance of the health of our planet, because it turns out that the way that we have been growing our food has been a significant contributor to climate emissions, to carbon emissions in our atmosphere. In fact, the agricultural sector is responsible for more emissions than the entire transportation sector. And a lot of it has to do with the chemicals that we're putting on the soil. It's killing the microbes, and therefore the carbon that was in the microbes, that was being held in the soil by the sticky glues of the bacteria and the spaghetti yarn of the fungi, all of that is suddenly released out into the atmosphere because the microbes aren't there to keep it in the soil where it needs to be. And so I always like to point out that Dr. Elaine Ingham suggests that if the entire world switched to regenerative growing, that we could solve the climate crisis in 3 years. That's it, 3 years, that's nothing. We can do it. I always find this so helpful. You know, we hear so much doom and gloom, and certainly there's a lot to be terrified of. But there is a solution. There is a solution that doesn't require geoengineering. The science is very, very solid, and it's actually a solution that is available to each one of us. And that is growing soil, growing food in a way that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it back in the soil. And let me be clear that regenerative agriculture is one of the only ways that we can undo the damage we have already done. So things like electric vehicles or solar panels, all these things are really important. We need to be doing them. You know, we should have implemented them like yesterday. But regenerative agriculture is one of the only tools that we have where we can actually pull carbon that we released decades ago. We can pull it out and put it back in the ground where it used to be, where it belongs. So hopefully that sort of piques your interest as to why growing or gardening in a regenerative manner can really be something positive that we each do, that we all take responsibility for, that's going to push us one step closer to solving the climate crisis. All right, so enough of the theory, enough of the science. I do want to touch on some practical tips and tricks and best practices that all you folks can put into practice in your planters and on your balcony and wherever, maybe in your community garden plot. So the benefits of a product like the soil booster are vast, and hopefully I've already articulated why having so many diverse microbial life in your soil is so important. A few of the benefits are here, and hopefully we've already discussed them extensively. But let's talk about what it is that you can do to implement these best practices. So number one, you want to try and always keep your soil protected. So I always like to say Mother Nature doesn't like to be naked. And this is true. This is one of the reasons why weeds move in so quickly, is that Mother Nature is trying to protect her soil with plants, with biomass above ground, and with roots below ground. And the reason is that when your soil is bare, it's exposed to the elements. So the wind can blow off that nice top level of humus that we're trying to keep. The various nutrients can be lost to the atmosphere. And even rain can have a detrimental impact on your soil. You know, one drop doesn't seem like very much, but if that drop again and again and again and again hits the soil directly, it can actually create compaction in your soil. So the best practice number one is always about trying to keep some kind of cover on your soil. Best case is to have your soil planted, right? With roots in the ground and leafy, large biomass above ground that's gonna catch the raindrop and then let it gently roll onto the soil. That being said, it's not always possible, right? It's hard to ensure you always have your field planted. So there's two more options as well. The first is to use something like a mulch. So whether it's wood chips or straw or dried leaves, whatever you have available, a mulch is a high carbon material that you apply on your soil, and it really acts as a protective shield. So that mulch layer will keep moisture in the soil, keeps the microbes happy, and ensures they don't get blown away. In a temporary solution, you can also use something like a tarp or a piece of plastic, but this is really something that you would only want to use short term, because having a big piece of plastic on your garden bed does limit the amount of oxygen that can get into the soil. And we want oxygen in soil. Healthy soil microbes breathe oxygen. It's the bad soil microbes, the pathogenic soil microbes. They are the ones that can survive without oxygen. And so they're the ones that thrive if your soil is compacted and there isn't enough air spaces. All right, number two, minimize tillage. So tillage, of course, is a fancy word for digging. And this really goes against best practices that you may have heard of in the past. You know, it wasn't that long ago when it was often recommended that you aerate your soil, you use a rototiller in your lawn, and you try and force oxygen into your soil. Well, turns out it doesn't really work that way. And when we dig in our soil, it's actually creating more damage than it is harm. When we're digging, we're severing those long fungal hyphae that exchange nutrients, that exchange information. We're exposing, the soil to environmental circumstances that it really doesn't want. Like I said, it breaks up the aggregate. So instead of having marbles, you end up having sand, where again, you run into compaction issues. So if you have to dig, which you shouldn't, but if you have to, do it once at the beginning of the season and then don't do it again. And, one way to implement this, for example, is at the end of the season, rather than pulling out all your dead brassicas and all the plants that have harvested, because you pull that out, you leave a big hole in the soil. You basically dug a big hole in the soil. So what you do instead is you simply cut off the top of your plant, whatever's above the soil, you lay it on the ground, and you just leave the roots in the soil. And that is going to feed the microbial life through the winter, so that next spring you have a really lush, fluffy soil that's got good structure thanks to those microbes. All right, number three, plant some cover crops. Now, cover crops are often discussed in terms of like large scale, big farms, but they can just as easily be applied to your backyard or to your balcony garden. And cover crops are really, it's a word for a crop that you grow that isn't really for eating, and it isn't for selling. It is really its only purpose is to improve the quality of your soil. Now, how it does that, well, there's lots of different ways, and it depends on the type of cover crop that you're using. Some cover crops are specifically for creating more nitrogen in your soil. So if you're using something like a legume, like a pea, that is a cover crop that's going to increase the nitrogen, the nitrate in your soil. And so that whatever plants you plant there next, they're going to have lots of nitrogen available to them. Other cover crops have other roles. So there's something called a tillage radish, So let's say you have some compaction in your soil, and I just told you you can't dig it out, right? Digging in your soil is not going to solve your compaction issue. What you can do is you can plant a tillage radish. And so this is a radish. It is edible, but apparently they don't taste very good. But really what they do is they have a really long taproot, a very strong taproot. And that taproot is able to dig down, 12, 15, 20 plus feet, and it will break through any of those hard compaction layers you have in the soil. It'll access nutrients from below, and it'll bring them up higher into the soil so that your other plants can access them. So whatever your problem is, there's probably a cover crop that can solve it. The other really important reason why cover crops are so fundamental to regenerative agriculture is that cover crops ensure that there are roots in the ground. And so what I really want to make clear is that the microbes in the soil depend on the sugar from the roots. If there aren't any roots in the soil, then there's no sugars being released out for the microbes, and eventually the microbes die. So the having cover crops in your soil is one way that you can ensure that your microbes always have a constant supply of those sugars so that the ecosystem is thriving. If you have one cover crop that's really easy to implement is something as simple as like a lettuce, or something that grows really fast, like radishes, because they have really big bushy leaves that can protect a lot of space above ground, and they grow really quickly. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just think about things that maybe are already growing and that have that big leafy space above ground that will help protect some of the soil and, of course, keep the roots in the ground. Diversity, I already discussed a little bit that it is a key component of regenerative agriculture. You always want to go for maximum diversity. So this includes in the type of plants that you're growing. You want to ensure that you have as many different types of plants as you possibly can. And that's because each plant will work with a slightly different set of microbes. And it, in fact, will change based on what stage of growth that they're at. So having a diverse crop selection is really important. And in terms of crop rotation, there's a bit of a lack of consensus, let's say, because Dr. Elaine Ingham suggests that a truly regenerative soil, a truly healthy, thriving soil should be able to handle growing the same crop year after year. It should have all the microbes, all the pest resistance, all the nutrients that it needs, and it should be able to produce that year after year after year. In reality, chances are your soil hasn't really reached peak regenerative of thriving yet. Certainly our soil hasn't here. So my suggestion always is continue to rotate your crops. Don't plant the same thing in the same place every year. It's simply, it doesn't hurt to rotate your crops, and it can save you some trouble. I'm not going to talk much about no chemicals because I think I already talked about that. At the end of the day, what's important to mention is that you don't want to be using chemical fertilizers or your Scott's Miracle-Gro or your chemical pesticides while you're also trying to grow regeneratively, right? You're going to cancel out. You want to, when you're growing regeneratively, you're looking after the soil, the health in the soil, and chemicals are the opposite of that. It takes a holistic perspective, and that includes incorporating livestock. So I totally recognize that that most people are not in a position to incorporate livestock into their community garden plot. Their neighbors probably wouldn't be too thrilled. But that being said, what is important, I always like to point out, especially because we have the the East End Climate Collective here, is that what has been shown is that if you raise livestock in a regenerative fashion, where you are paying attention to the soil and looking after the soil, and ultimately you're doing something called rotational grazing, where you break your big field up into small components, and every day you move your cattle onto a new component so that the other components have lots of time to rest and regrow. What's important about this is that it turns out that cattle grown in this method do not contribute to methane emissions in the same way that cattle that are grown at a factory farm. And the difference comes down to their poop. So a factory farmed cattle is pooping out onto concrete slabs. And ultimately that manure is going to turn into methane gas and contribute further to the climate crisis. However, what they found is that if you're raising livestock in a regenerative fashion with rotational grazing, your soil is so healthy, it's so alive with microbial life that it quickly digests that manure before it has time to go anaerobic and turn into methane. And so this is, I don't know why, I guess I always like to point this out because, you know, there's the people that are like, we can't eat meat, nobody can eat meat if we're gonna, you know, have a livable planet in 100 years. And then there's other people who are like, I'm never giving up my steaks, just not gonna happen over my dead body. And I would suggest there is a middle path. And of course, it means reduced meat consumption, no doubt. But if you have to have meat, look for that has been grown regeneratively, because you can feel confident that it's actually contributing as a carbon sink instead of releasing further carbon into the atmosphere. All right, last but not least, let's talk about compost. One of my favorite topics, of course. There's two different types of compost, and this is an important distinction. The type of compost, of course, compost is the way when you can't have cattle or chicken, you use compost instead, because effectively you're using a product from that livestock, right? So regular compost, let's say that big bag of sheep manure that you buy at Home Depot, it has been through a high heat process, a thermophilic process. And what that means is that the end product is very high in carbon, which is good. We want carbon, we need carbon in our soil, the microbes live in the carbon, but it's effectively a sterile product. There really isn't much life or much biology in a big bag of sheep manure, and that's because it all got killed off by the high heat. That was, in fact, what they were trying to do, was kill all the bad microbes. Unfortunately, they just end up killing all the microbes. The difference with worm compost is that, oh, someone's microphone's off. So the difference with worm compost is that high levels of microbes are found in worm compost. And the difference is that worm compost hasn't gone through that high heat. It has gone through a medium heat process. And more importantly, it's gotten entirely covered in the worm's intestine with all those microbes that live in there, so that the end product is just entirely coated with those microbes. And this is really important, because to have your best growing season ever, you really need both. You need your regular big bag of compost, because that's going to provide that carbon input. And you need a biofertilizer like the soil booster that's going to have the high levels of microbial life that will inoculate your soil. And it is important to mention that you don't need a lot of the soil booster to be effective. You really only just need a small amount. And that is because we're not, unlike a chemical fertilizer, which is force feeding your plant with, whether it wants it or not, it has to eat it. What the soil booster, what the worm manure does instead is it offers a microbial buffet to your plants. And I think I mentioned earlier that each plant will pick and choose which microbes it wants to work with, which microbes are going to be able to provide the nutrients that it needs at that specific time. So that's one of the nice benefits of the product, is that you can use it on any soil-based plant, and that plant will find the microbes that are right for it. As well, it also suggests why you only need a very little bit. You're simply trying to inoculate the soil. It can be used in a variety of ways. If you're starting seeds, probably we're a little bit past seed starting time, but certainly you can put a little bit in with your seed starting mix. And the nice thing about that is those microbes will be ready and waiting as soon as your seed germinates. They'll immediately be able to start feeding nutrients and things like, growth stimulators, all the things that seed needs. Another really, really great way to use it, which is still applicable probably at this time of the year, is for transplanting. So what we suggest is, if you're moving your tomatoes out, hopefully you waited. I know we waited until the cold weather passed. So what we'll be doing this week when we move our tomatoes out, we dig the hole, we take a handful, we put the soil booster in the hole, and then we sit the tomato into the hole. And what that allows is the root system of the tomato interfaces with the microbes in the soil booster, so that the microbes can immediately start talking with the plant and the roots, and immediately get to work delivering nutrients, reducing transplant shock, and ensuring a thriving plant. Certainly, you can definitely also use it as a maintenance product or as a top dressing. You would just sprinkle it around the base of the plant and then water well. And I should mention, in all these cases, you do want to be watering well when using it, because the microbes have been put in a dehydrated state. They've effectively been put to sleep so that they can live in the bag. And then we do need to wake them up by rehydrating them with water. So you always want to be watering well. And last but not least, I have to mention, because I get this question all the time, what is the difference between a Jocelyn soil booster worm manure and a generic bulk brand of worm castings? And it all comes down to what those worms are eating. So most bulk worm castings are a byproduct of the bait worm industry. So that's, big companies that sell worms to fishermen. They have to keep those worms in a cooler all winter. And so those worms usually are eating one thing and one thing alone, either sawdust or soy meal. And then they're pooping it out. The problem with that is that the lack of diversity going into that worm results in a lack of diversity coming out of that worm. So what's different about our worms is our worms are eating a huge buffet of feedstocks every day. Everything from, fruit and veg waste, along to high carbon materials like paper towels, paper plates. No 2 days are the same in terms of what's available for them to eat. And the result is that the finished product has a higher diversity of microbial life. And that's really the difference between a product like ours and something else that you might find on the market. All right, we're here. We're at the end. We made it. I hopefully have done a serious